Hi, this is Chris Haughey. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. I did an experiment and I'm so excited to share this project. Believe it or not, I painted this entire design using FolkArt Chalk Paint. I love this paint and I wanted to see how flexible and workable it was. I was amazed at the coverage and the results. Stay tuned to find out how to use this fantastic paint in ways you never imagined. Grab your brushes and let's get started. I am working with an MDF surface and normally I seal it, but because I'm using the chalk paint, no prep is required. I've picked up some sheepskin with my 3/4 inch oval wash, just kind of slapping it on. And then I picked up a little bit of patina and starting at the outer edge, just kind of blending it toward the center. I'm kind of toggling back and forth between the sheepskin and the patina. I did drop down to the vintage teal to darken the bottom just a little bit. I used the distress mister to mist a little bit of water on to make the paint a little more fluid and allow more open time. Once it dries, I lightly sand it. Oh my gosh, this paint is like silk after you sand it. This background is created with layers. So I let it dry, lightly sand it, and then just repeat that same technique. Gives a little bit of movement. I love the way that looks, kind of like the color just softly shifts from dark to light around the edge, just even lighter toward the middle. And I'm using more so the side of my brush instead of the chisel edge to slap. You don't have any stop and start lines by doing it that way. You just get a very soft blend. Very light touch, just a whisper of a brush to blend it in. As long as the paint is still moist, you can repeat adding more paint on there. This is a technique that I love to use to add just a little more design in the background. It makes it a little more interesting. I drop down to a darker teal, the vintage teal, to just very softly dry brush that design in there. When I got to the bottom, it disappeared because that's the color I used. So I just picked up a lighter touch of lighter color and just so I could create some contrast. After I did this, it does add design in the background, but once everything's painted in there, it's very minimal what can be seen. So don't stress over this. This is just a fun way, and this can be used on any background. It's just a really great way to just ramp up the interest. And you can see I'm just using portions of the stencil. I picked out parts that I really like, the little rounded area, and I don't want to repeat the same not only direction but the same portions of the stencil. So I kind of just shifted around, kind of tweak the angles a little bit so there's a difference in not only design but the angle. It just really becomes just that interesting quiet background. Picking up a little bit of castle to shade around the outer edge. I really like this background. I wasn't sure I wanted to put a little distress on here, but using my 1/2 inch awesome angle, it's just a little bit longer bristle, and I really have thinned down the paint quite a bit with water. This is it's much heavier bodied, so it's a lot of moisture really helps it to move around. To continue to add more interest, I picked up a little bit of Java and put a thin puddle on my paint palette, kind of drag the palette knife through. There's just a skim of paint on the back side and just kind of rub it, and it results in this amazing texture that is just quite impressive. Now if you get too much, you'll get a dark spot like that. I just took my damp paper towel, kind of lifted it off. I want it to look a little bit antique and distressed, so I'm okay with a little bit of heaviness on that. But this is Java. It's a rich, beautiful color, and there's no other way to achieve this texture look other than with a palette knife. And I like the inexpensive plastic ones because the paint is thin and the metal ones don't get quite as much flexibility, and you have to work a lot harder to get that result. And you can see just how little bit of paint is on the bottom of my palette knife, and I can still get results from that. Wanted to add a little more texture, so I'm taking my splatter brush, I've thinned down the Java, splattering it because I want it to look a little more distressed or not quite so strong. I just misted it again with that distress sprayer, and you can see how it softly diffuses those splatters, and they're not just little round dots, it's just interesting. I did create a line for the tabletop, and I wanted it to be dark behind the lace area. I started out with a 1/2 inch angle, bumped up to a 3/4 inch angle because I really wanted it to be dark, and you can see it's kind of choppy. I'm just taking my mop brush to just kind of tone it down. I don't want it to be perfectly shaded. I like that looseness. This stencil is really offensive. I've not done this before to create lace like this. So I started out with Castle, and I decided I only wanted one row of those little dashes at the top. So I just took the tape and covered that up. I wanted to do the Castle, and I thought maybe that would be layered with the other colors that would build it up. Now remember, this is the first time I've used this paint in this type of application, so this is a learning experience for me. Loaded my brush. This stuff works wonderful with stenciling because it's thicker. It doesn't run under the stencil, so I was able to get crisper, cleaner lines, and it's just a real subtle design. And I put my frame on there because I don't want to stencil past the frame. Using my chalk pencil, it erases with moisture, so I can draw on it. I don't have to worry about erasing it later. It will automatically disappear when I add shading. Adding a layer of sheepskin. This is not quite white, just a little bit softer, and you can see how beautifully that's turning out. But I thought maybe with that Castle base coat, the sheepskin would be a little bit brighter. I thought maybe that turquoise would mute it down a little bit. So that's why I chose to put Castle underneath. I'm not sure I would have needed to, but it built up the color just beautifully. And I've loaded my Spectacular stencil brush with that sheepskin. I didn't put a solid heavy coverage on. I just wanted to get placement for the lace. So now I'm taking my 1/2 inch angle and Java, and I wanted to darken, add like a shadow underneath of the edge of the lace, just floating that in there. You can see how loose. I have a great deal of moisture in my brush. Just wanted to really float that in there nice and almost kind of misty, a little bit of movement. Putting that back in there, I did go with white Adirondack to really ramp up the brightness of that lace. With that dark background, I really thought that contrast would make it really stand out. And I'm using almost a pounce and a dry brush. I load my stencil brush, wipe the excess off on a paper towel. I didn't go edge to edge. You can see I just went up to where that white pen mark is. I wanted this to look like it was organdy, so it was just a little bit translucent lace. I didn't want it to just be the design, so I'm floating the white Adirondack over top of it, letting that bottom edge be just a little bit ruffled. Let that dry, and then I went across the top edge, so all of it has that little bit of glazing of the white over top of it. Wanted to add some folds in the lace, and I put that one on the left. I will move that later on. My paint is very loose, very thin. I believe that it's much easier to work in layers. That way, if you need to change anything, it's so much easier to manipulate the paint and move it around. I thought it would look better to have the folds uneven, but it looked kind of messy. I didn't like the way that looked. So I'm trying to work around it, but I don't like it. I did go back and highlight. There's where I'm erasing. I'm just taking my wet brush because the paint is not on there heavy and it's a little bit loose when I put it on. It's super easy to lift. So I did move the folds over. It just looks so much better when they were even. And I just used the white, kind of brightening up those center highlights, and anywhere it looks like it just needs a little more brightness added to it. This is such an easy way to create a lace tablecloth edge. Love doing it this way. I did forget to turn my camera on, so I base coated the tin pot with Castle, and I used my number 10 flat and just put that, stroked it on. It's not heavy. I let that background kind of glow through. Picked up a little bit of Java on my 1/2 inch awesome angle. And the reason it's awesome is because the extra length on it lets me have a longer, smoother stroke. And you can see how much stroke I can get out of a loaded brush. I don't have to go back and reload. I did decide my light source is going to come from the top and the left. So that's where all the highlights will be mostly directed. Picked up a little bit of white Adirondack, my number 5 radical round, to put those ridges on there. Now I'm just going back in to add a little more shading above and below those ridges, because this pot is this whole design is rustic. I didn't want the pot to be perfect either, so I'm allowing it to be just a little bit, I don't want to say it, a little more rustic. So it does the floating. I didn't want it to be soft and perfect. I wanted to allow that to just show a little bit of texture. I'm putting some of the vintage teal in there. That's the color in the background, but when you bring it forward and repeat it, and I'll do this in everything that, all parts of the design, it just really pulls it all together. It gives it a nice continuity. Dry brushing some white Adirondack highlights in, and I decided to go in around the edges of that ridge just a little bit. I put the turquoise on there, and then I put the little bit of shading on there, and then I go back and add a little more highlights, kind of build it up. Not one place in particular, but the whole pot is kind of built up at the same time, so that the light looks like it's reflecting everywhere consistently. Now I'm going back. I've added the highlights. I added the shading to begin with, but it wasn't super heavy. Added the highlights in there, and now I can go back and reinforce those, the shading. And because the paint is so thin, the layers of paint that's underneath kind of glow through, and they just build to give that amazing texture that it just takes several layers to achieve that. And I think it's so much easier to paint this way. You can kind of paint a little bit, go back and look at it and see if it's coming together the way you want it to come together. And if you need to tweak it a little bit here and there, it's so much easier at this point when you're going back and forth, as opposed to trying to get it perfect the first time around. I wanted to add that same texture on the pot. It almost looks like some of that paint's just a little chipped off. So instead of doing the flat of the knife, I just kind of did the toe of the knife, because it gives me just a little less knife to work with. If I had a smaller knife, I would have jumped to a smaller knife, but I'm just using part of the knife. And I had to be careful because I did get some blobs on there, and playing around with it. It's just, but because the paint is so easy to manipulate, it's not an issue if it's too heavy. You can either lift it or blend it out. It's really a fun technique, and the results I think are quite impressive. And but you do have to be patient. Don't overload it. Here I just used the edge of the knife to kind of sharpen that highlight on the tip of those ridges. You can see how I'm kind of just honing in on the tips. And I did go back and forth quite a few times. I put a highlight up there, but then I realized that the flowers are going to cover it up. But good practice, I guess. I did spend a little bit of time just kind of going back and forth, but when you're using this technique, it's not going to be perfect the first time. So it's kind of fun to play around with it and see how it builds up, because you'll be amazed. It's just almost kind of magical. Pay attention to little details like the roundness of those little rims. Those are the things that really pull it together nicely. Again, just tweaking it a little bit. I do want some shading on that left side, even though that's a highlight side. Still need to show that. I double loaded my number 10 flat with the antique green and vintage teal. And I just kind of touch it down, press and pull. I let this just really be a very loose stroke. And if you're uncomfortable with it, practice a little bit, because it's really a fun way to add leaves very quickly. And I did want some foliage in the background, so I just kind of flicked them in, not being very particular. I wanted to try and use that 10 flat for the petals on the daisies, and I started out with sheepskin. I wanted a stronger base because I figured the yellow would probably be just a little bit translucent. And you can see how I based my flower. I just kind of drew rounds and spears and sketched my flower in so I could find my center and just pull the petals in from that way. And I'm just taking the brush, touching and pulling towards the center of the flower petals. And I really like the way that the petals came out. It's not real perfect, but I have some black-eyed Susans that are blooming outside my kitchen window. I went out and took pictures of them, and the petals are very irregular. It's not like a daisy petal. They don't all have that perfect tip. They're kind of pointy, kind of rounded. So letting the brush just pull these petals out, and I let them overlap. I thought that would be a little more interesting. Some are facing toward the center, some are kind of a side view, a top view. I wanted to keep this very random and a little more natural. And I did have a photo for reference so that I could get a better idea of how they just kind of grew. Took the same brush, I loaded it, double loaded it with the antique green and a little bit of that summer porch, just to give a lighter color on those leaves. And it's a little more of a Kelly green than a Viridian with the blue in it. And these leaves are just a touch and a pull out, and if you get the hang of that, they come out perfect. I wasn't too particularly fussy about the leaf shapes because I knew this is mostly for placement. I'm going to go back, add some shading and highlighting, and this is where you can really hone in on the shape and turn them into good looking leaves. I took my 18-aught Epic script liner, loaded it with a little bit of that antique green to paint the stems and connect the leaves. Doing the same thing with Summer Porch. This is where I'm bringing the yellow in, just top coating those petals. Again, I wasn't real fussy about, making sure that they covered each bit of the base coating, but I found out because I applied the paint with the same angle that it pretty much covered it perfectly. But keep in mind there's many layers of shadowing and highlighting that will be applied to these, so if it's not perfect, that's okay. It can be tweaked with the added layers. And I had to be careful not to overload my brush and when I touched down, because it left a blob of paint instead of that nice little cute sharp point. And again, not all of them have a sharp point, but I wanted it to be substantially similar. So at this stage of the design, I just was looking at balance to see if the flowers were kind of in the proper area and that they filled out the vase nicely. The Black-Eyed Susans have a little cone-shaped dome in the center, so I'm using my number 5 Radical Round, just kind of tapping it in. I didn't want it to be smooth and perfect because it's a very rough, kind of, I don't know if I could call it a fluffy little dome, but just getting that in there so that picking up a little bit of vintage mustards to lay in some of the shadow areas. And this is more blocking in than shading. I'm just using the chisel edge because I was thinking that if I pulled it out on the chisel edge, it would kind of look like veining down the flower petals. So I'm just pulling it out. And as I go through this entire project, I toggle back and forth between highlights and the shadow areas. And it just really, to me, I felt like it built it up so much nicer. So I would consider this just blocking in the shadow areas just to distinguish where those shadows are. Picked up a little bit of thinned green just to kind of fill in. I didn't want it to look empty behind the flowers, so I just kind of put a little bit in there. Picked up some white Adirondack, and you kind of have to think where the sunlight or where the light source is going to splash on the petals. I knew I definitely wanted the center flower to be more of the focal flower, so anywhere the brightest highlights are, that will be brought forward. So I'm just kind of blocking that in. This was so much fun because I wasn't even sure, even when I got towards the end, I wasn't sure it was going to come out well. So I was very relaxed when I was painting this because I thought, well, you know, if it turns out nice, that's great, but if it doesn't turn out, I'll just keep playing around with it until I'm happy with it or start over. So I think when you're painting something completely new, it's fun to have a good mindset, relax, and just enjoy the process. I learned so much painting with this chalk paint. I really had a fun time playing around with it. A little bit of the sheepskin to highlight, light source top left, so that's where I wanted to highlight these little cones, the centers, and when I put the Java in with the Radical Round, I just tapped it in so it wasn't super heavy. So I'm just going back to reinforce those darker areas. I always think it's fun to add a little bit of dip dots. I did find out with the chalk paint, because it's a heavier bodied paint, to get a nice little round dot, I needed to add enough moisture to thin it down to make it create that little dot. Otherwise they're really teeny tiny and they don't show up very well. And I think that just adds a little bit of whimsy. It helps to lighten that center area up, breaks up that heaviness. I picked up some of the vintage teal, and that's a dark color that I used in the background, putting it as a shade, and I'm using my 1/4 inch awesome angle to shade the base of those leaves, kind of splashing it around some of the other foliage as well. Just really gives a nice kind of a teal color to that background. Because it's just super thin on my brush, I can just do indications of foliage in the background. Kind of helps filter that out, fill it in just really nicely. I encourage you to play around because it's such a fun process. I do have a lot of downtime where I'm thinking. I was looking at the flowers and I thought they were just a little bit too white. These are black-eyed Susans, which are very yellow. So I'm trying to decide how I'm going to address that. Went in with very thin vintage teal. Wasn't sure how that was going to look, but it creates this absolutely stunning kind of a translucent, transparent blue shadow. And you can see how I'm using that. Just, it's a hint of color. Look what a difference that makes. It really goes in. I can separate out the petals. I can add shadowing where the front flower lays over the back flowers. It's such a hint of paint. I thought maybe that's what would help with these yellow daisies to look more like the black-eyed Susans. And I do go back several times and put just layers over it. It's starting to pull it together, and I love that touch of blue on there. I'm kind of in a blue mode right now where I'm finding out just that unexpected hint of color. What a difference that makes. And you can see how all these flowers are starting to separate out, and you can see where they overlay. I wanted that center one to be in front of, so I can just add that shading in there, and it just really separates it out so nicely. And it can go way down in the background depending on how much shading is added. And if I decide I should have had a petal there and I don't, I can go back and lay that in, picking up some of that yellow, toning down that white. This is a process of back and forth. If you have trouble deciding if it's the right amount of shading or highlighting, either take a picture of it, you can squint at it, hold it in front of a mirror. There's several ways you can look at it and say, oh, I think I need more color here. Ask a friend. Ask a friend that's going to be honest with you. And just add that hint of color, because I'm adding that hint of yellow over top that strong white. It brightens it up substantially. See how that just tones it down just enough to make it look a little more yellow. And I was really worried about putting that blue over the yellow because I didn't want my flowers to be green. But boy, what a beautiful decision that was. Just kind of playing around, little touches of color. I thought I needed to add some shading underneath the flower petals that hang over the pot, but I used thin Java. I really wanted to keep that very subtle and soft, so I had to thin it down quite a bit because, boy, a little bit of that color is super strong. I decided I liked the blue a little bit better, so even where I put the Java, I go back and strengthen it or do a little bit of a wash of the blue over top of it. Just taking my brush, kind of fine-tuning those tips. Remember I said, the flower petals don't have to be perfect. Well, if they're not and it really looks odd, this is where you can go back and just touch them up a bit. And this is where it makes a difference. Decided I went back and strengthened that Java center, but it just was too dark. So I took some of that vintage teal and I shaded it on the bottom and right side of the center flower centers. Wow. I love when I impress myself and it just really is beautiful. So don't be afraid to try things. I thought if I didn't like the way it looked, all I had to do was just, because the paint was so loose, just wipe it off and remove it. I wanted to detail those, the triple little petals. So I just loaded some of that summer porch on the toe of my 1/4 inch angle, kind of pulled it down one side of the leaf and down the center. Just helps to brighten them up. They're not quite so good looking at this point. So adding that little bit of a highlight on there helps them, it kind of coordinates them with the flowers, brings that yellow in nicely, and then also it will brighten those petals up or leaves up really well. This paint is super thin, so I can add layers when it dries. It seems like with the chalk paint, when it dries, it doesn't shift. Sometimes paint, when it dries, shifts in color quite a bit. This one kind of maintains what you see as what you get. So if you're not sure you like it, do it very lightly, and then you can go back and kind of tweak it. Adding background leaves in wherever I think there's a little bit of void in the flowers. I wanted to add some berries, and I'm using sheepskin. This is a not quite white, it's an off-white. Using my painter's pal for the berries. If you want perfect berries, you have to use a template, because this is something that will really make a big difference. If your berries aren't round, it can really throw it off. And I had them all the same size, but I did change the one at the top, bump the size down on that just a little bit. Decided I wanted to add another set of leaves in there. Put it in, didn't like it, so I wiped it off and redid it. It's just really easy to work with this chalk paint. And I did the same thing, just add a little bit of the summer porch down the side to brighten it up. And it was a little bit wet, that's why the paint wasn't sticking very well. A little bit of that teal on the opposite side and at the base of the leaf. And this is the color that I think kind of created magic all through the whole design, is adding that dark vintage teal in there. Just a super rich color. Loaded my Epic script liner with the summer porch and just line those tiny little veins down the center of the leaf. That little bit of detail adds so much interest, a lot of drama. It looks like you spent hours and hours, probably in total. And I did take out some of the dry time and when I did this video, but probably in total it took about 2 hours to do this entire design. The chalk paint dries very, very nicely. It has a beautiful finish on it. You don't have to put a varnish over it, a final varnish, unless you want to. Again, you don't have to base coat. Using Java to add the stems to the berries. And I'm using my Epic script liner for that. My Epic script liner is just a little bit longer than a liner, shorter than a script, so that's super control but long line length. So you can go a pretty good distance before you have to reload. And I did go back with a little bit of summer porch, just to add a little bit of highlight on some of those stems. And guess what? I put that vintage teal on the berries. I thought since I had it everywhere else, it needed to be on the berries. And what color do you shade berries with? Brown definitely would not have worked for this. I just love that overall colors on the project. It's kind of funny, Plaid sent me some sample paints to play around with for the chalk paint, so that's why I use the colors. These are the colors that I had requested, and these were the only ones I had, so, and it turned out just beautifully. I'm just going back with a little bit of that vintage mustard to yellow up those flower petals. Going in with white Adirondack. Love, love, love the white Adirondack. It really is a bright white and very, very opaque. So, and it dries quickly. I can go back and ramp it up just with another little bit. I like to work like all the flower petals at the same time because I can build up the brightness. You have a single light source, so your highlights should reflect that same value of brightness. So if I brighten up one petal, I need to also kind of keep consistent brightness here and there so that it all looks like it's under that same light source. And I'm just going back, kind of touching here and there. Not a little bit of paint makes a big difference. My motto. So little bits of paint to really brighten that up. Here's where I had a big a design decision, and I decided I wanted to try to use this is a 0.05 black micron pen to detail everything, and it was definitely the right choice. Now on these little berries, what I did was I just went one size bigger than what I actually stenciled, and it's just perfect to outline. And if you try to do this without a template, good luck, because I am not that good that I'm going to get a perfect round circle. And using the template, just bump up one size, it just really is amazing. And I am outlining it very loosely. I don't want perfect smooth lines. I think it just makes it a little more artsy. A bit timid when using a permanent pen, and these microns are absolutely wonderful. Once they dry, they are super permanent. They won't reconstitute with any kind of moisture, so they're perfect for doing this. But on the flip side, you can get a little bit nervous using the pen because you know it's not removable, so that's always a concern. So I started out a little bit light-handed, made a mistake. I took a damp paper towel, and I found out you can remove it if you do it immediately, so that helped my nerves a little bit. And I kept my line work, my stroke work very loose, and I think that really adds to the whole overall design. This is kind of a rustic piece, so if everything's super perfect, then the continuity is a little bit lost. Once I started becoming a little more comfortable using the pen, and you cannot go super fast. Just take your time and slow down and let the pen flow. If the two factors, if the paint's not dry, it won't work. But also, if the pen moves faster than the ink can flow down to the nib, then you kind of get a skip. So once I was comfortable with the speed, I could pretty much go at a pretty steady clip. I found out after I worked with it a little while and was comfortable with it, I started adding more lines. For example, added a little bit of line work at the base of the petals to look like veining. And everything that I did, I was really pleased with. I thought it worked so well together. And if I zoom in, you can see how imperfect it is, but that's okay. The whole design can be just very loose, and it really works. This is just that type. So if you do want a project where you don't have to worry about being super fussy, this is perfect. Such a great way. And I did the stems, I did all the vein work on the petals. I did a little bit of swirly scratchy at the bottom right hand side of the flower centers, just to kind of break up that solidness. Again, just to add a little more design. I did a little bit on the stems if they were a little bit weak. I just wanted this design to be very consistent. Added some on the background foliage, but not a lot. I think the flowers and the petals and the berries were the focal point. So I can go in and just kind of do that jagged outer edge, add a few little vein works, and it works so well with the vein work that was added before. It just enhances it and just makes it all work together very nicely. I did decide to add a little starburst at the tip of the berries. They seem kind of plain and empty. I did do a little bit of line work on the container vase as well. I decided if I was going to do that much, I needed to be consistent. And I don't know that this shows up a whole lot, but it did seem to make a difference. And you can see how nice that turned out. What a difference. So the next day I was looking at it and I decided I needed to add a little bit more down at the base, like a little cluster of berries. And so I'm just repeating what I did up above, double loading my number 10 Fabulous Flat with the antique green and yellow porch or summer porch. I have to struggle with these names. I used my Epic script liner to line those stems, sheepskin to paint the berries, and I did a couple different sizes just to bring that down. Used thin Java to do the stems on the berries. And a little bit of that vintage teal to add the shading on the leaves. It was kind of funny because I had just done the others the night before, but with the pen work they looked so different and I wasn't sure I was doing it correctly, and I thought, well, this will be good, kind of a refresher to do the instructions to do them the second time. A little bit of the vintage teal on the berries and pop it up with that white Adirondack. I thought I needed some, I call them ghost leaves in the background, so I'm just adding the indication of distant little bit of leaves in the background just to kind of fill it in so it doesn't look empty back there. Just thin down that vintage teal, add some leaves, a few little stems, just kind of filler flowers or filler foliage. But what a difference, and kind of going crazy with that vintage teal, little touches here and there, maybe a little bit of a shadow. But what a difference on the leaves up above compared to the leaves down below without the pen work on them. I have such a soft hint of that vintage teal on my brush that I can go in and just enhance some of those shaded areas without being too strong. Adding a little bit of highlights on some of those stems on the berries. They were Java, so they were just dark. So, it's just these little touches that make a big difference. Anywhere a contrast is needed, that little pop of paint just really, it does make such a difference. And just kind of toggle back and forth. I remember I did those the next day, so I have to go back and make sure they're all consistent. And adding this line work is exactly what makes a difference. And that little starburst in the berries. This is kind of another way to really ramp up your design. And if you're not real thrilled with the perfection, using pen work on it can eliminate that, and just it pulls it all together just beautifully. And what a difference that pen work makes on those leaves. Absolutely gorgeous. Still playing around with some of the shading on the background. I'm trying to decide if I want shadowing down below the berries, behind the berries. I don't think so much, and I kind of wipe that off because if I do it there, then I need to do it in other places, and I think I have quite a bit going on. So just adding little hints of kind of a distance foliage or that little bit of blue in the shadowing. And I have such a light amount of color on my brush that it's safe to play around with it, because if I don't like it, I can just lift it up. So this whole design has been a great play piece, and I've just enjoyed every moment of it. Just absolutely, totally impressed with the FolkArt paint. On the frame, I was going to do it Java, but it was too dark. And I'm using the cosmetic sponge because it has such a flat bottom on it. And I'm just dabbing Java on, and then I picked up a little bit of the vintage teal, and then I didn't clean my sponge, but I picked up a little bit of the antique green, and I'm kind of tapping it around. I left the green more and the teal more to the bottom, just kind of brought mostly teal toward the top, so it's just a little bit heavier looking with the green at the bottom. It was awfully dark, so I thinned down patina, and I'm just splattering a little bit of that color on the frame, and it just brightened it up enough to break up that darkness. Love how it turned out. This chalk paint is so workable and so easy to play around with. Doesn't that look nice? It just fits the picture perfectly. I love how this turned out and hope you are as impressed with the versatility of the chalk paint as I am. Everything I use is listed in the links below. If you want to paint this design with acrylic paint, I did list the Americana substitute in the instructions. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. I would love to hear from you, especially if you try the chalk paint. Let me know what you think. Be sure to like and subscribe to my channel so you won't miss out on future videos. I want to thank you again for joining me on this unusual painting project, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. Remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.